Welcome everyone to the Becky's Anonymous live stream. This Black History Month, we're discussing the topic of abolition, discussing how the abolition movement has evolved over the history of this country. And in this contemporary moment, discussing how if we are to truly be in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, we must be talking about abolishing the prison industrial complex. And we have two great guests today who are going to help us understand what we mean by abolition and how our audience and those of us who are also tuning in from other places can get involved with the abolition movement today, tomorrow. And so I will be including very soon with us our two guests from Showing Up for Racial Justice Boston. SURJ, which many of you in Becky's Anonymous may already be familiar with. We've discussed a lot of their actions and have a lot of their members involved with us as well. So we're very excited to continue our connection with SURJ. And so I'll be joined by Kate and Elizabeth in a moment, who will introduce themselves and share why they're here and part of this conversation and help us continue to explore what we mean by being a part of the abolition movement of today. And so Kate and Elizabeth, I just want to invite you to our live stream and welcome. And as I said,
thank you.
Awesome to have you both. And if you could start with just sharing a little bit about yourself, how you're a part of the abolition movement of today, what brought you to this conversation, and then we'll take it from there. I know Elizabeth, at certain points, we might be referring to you as Elizabeth and Ruckus, so please share that with us as well in your intro. But why don't you take it away with your intro, Elizabeth?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Elizabeth or Ruckus. I always say you can call me anything but late for dinner, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm a member leader in Showing Up for Racial Justice Boston, as you said, Lee. I've been involved since late 2016, early 2017. And I'm a member of the abolitionist movement through a variety of organizations and relationships. In addition to my work with Showing Up for Racial Justice Boston, I sit on the Deeper Than Water Coalition, which is an abolitionist coalition working to address toxic human and environmental conditions inside of Massachusetts prisons. And I've also, like a volunteer, longtime close associate of Black and Pink Massachusetts, which is an LGBTQ prison abolition collective. And I write to several people behind the wall. I always like to call their names into the space. Their names are Gary, Axel, Hamad, and Wayland.
Awesome. Thank you. And want to just share quickly for people viewing that SURJ is a national organization. So while we're going to be talking a lot about kind of from a local lens, we always use you all as a great example, because you can think about not only how is this work happening in Boston, but across the country as well, and use us as an example. So thank you so much for being a part of this today, Ruckus. And Kate, please.
Yeah, thanks. Really happy to be here. My name is Kate. I use they or she pronouns, and I'm a fairly recent part of the Prison Abolition Action Partnership in SURJ-Boston. I've for about a year, helping to do things like political education and resource redistribution. I have been brought into working towards abolition relationship with a pen pal that I have through Black and Pink, similar to Ruckus. His name is Tay, and really excited to be here in this space, particularly because I think that like white people have a lot at stake in doing the reimagining of relationships that abolition calls us to do, and really excited about like practicing that with white people and in relationship with Becky's Anonymous. So thanks for having us.
Awesome. And I'm sure there's a couple of things you have referenced that people are like, wait, I want to hear more about that. And we will later on in our time together talk more specifically a lot of the actions that you all referenced. So thank you for sharing that with us. But I think before we get to that, want to step back a little bit and first really talk about what do we mean by abolition. want to take a moment to reflect on what have we meant and historically as the abolition movement. How do you all see that the abolition movement is still something that we need today? So just ground us a little bit in kind of that word abolition. What do we mean by that?
Kate, did you want to take this one?
Sure. Yeah, so I think the way that I came to abolition and came to understand it as it is today was actually how I think a lot of people come to understand it in the last 10 years, which is through The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, who really kind of frames abolition as a new order of social control similar to slavery. And so that was how the word was used in the past, and that's often a point of access for people now. In the last few years, I've really come to understand a very broadened sense of what abolition means today and what it actually has always meant, which I think is really that it's a movement that centralizes liberation. It's not just the absence of police and prisons and slavery, but it is about the liberation of all peoples and the ability to have well-being and safety as a given in all of our lives. So yeah, I think that's my access point to abolition now. And that's how I think about it when we are talking about defunding the police and creating something else. Marcus, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of good quotes about this. I think one of my favorites is from Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who talks about abolition as being presence, not absence. So I think one thing that you'll notice as a theme, as we follow the leadership of the National Council of Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls and Families for Justice's Healing, its Roxbury-based node, is that there's also this emphasis on creating space for encouraging and supporting the reimagining of our world, and hashtag reimagining communities is something that I hear a lot. So yeah, and the abolition movement historically, right? I mean, I think one thing that is important to me to always lift up is that it is the long game of Black liberation. That's what my relationships and study have taught me. I think a myth, for example, that I hear a lot about slavery is that it was, people at the time thought it was fine, but we can go back into really I'm going to be terrible with dates, but we can go back into 1000 AD sort of era and find people objecting to slavery. For example, from the point of view of people who are in what is Africa today. So I think that's an important thing. It's also important to note that that we not equate slavery and prisons. It's kind of slavery might happen in prisons, but it is not the same thing. And I think much as again Marissa Alexander kind of argues in the book, it kind of maintains the same social structures. I think I'm sure a lot of listeners have heard of that book. I would also, if people want to take another step in learning through reading, I would really recommend The Golden Gulag by Ruth Wilson Gilmore. And in that book, basically Ruth Wilson Gilmore is outlining how the California prison system developed to the point that it is today, where it's one of the most extensive prison systems in the country. And she makes the important point that it serves basically two functions. One is to suppress Black and brown people, and two is to warehouse surplus labor. So under racial capitalism, it's really necessary in order to keep the cost of workers low, that there be a lot of workers. So if there's 100,000 people who need a job, they're going to be cheaper to gain under racial capitalism than if there were only 100, for example. And the prison system upholds white supremacy and racial capitalism by containing the dissent of people who are not getting their basic needs met, who are racialized as Black and brown, and also people who are indigenous. And it serves, and I think what Marissa Alexander argues super well in her book, right, is that it's the surveillance leading up to, it's the felon status afterward, it's parole, it's probation, it's the courts, it's all those pieces working to suppress and contain, both in the sense of racial supremacy of white people, and through like the suppression of labor, because when people are not able to access, like to get their needs met, then there might be a revolution, right? I think I was talking to Kate about this in preparation and thinking back to the Arab Spring when I was in college, and that was a narrative. Like there's all these unemployed people, and so they're ready to go and like have a revolution in the United States. The sheer scale of incarceration it can be seen as one of the things that is suppressing revolutionary activity.
Mm. Yeah, can I add something also? I mentioned in my intro that I mentioned personal stake, and as Ruckus just so eloquently put, the prison industrial complex and policing and all forms of policing are very much a tool of the dominant social order and white supremacy. And so when I think about abolition and what it means to me personally, I'm thinking about the fact that like a function of white supremacy is that I cannot believe myself to be like unconsciously or consciously, I cannot believe myself and my white body to be supreme and also believe that my well-being is like interconnected with the well-being of others. And so abolition means like fostering that understanding of the world and creating structures in our lives and in our most intimate relationships that support that belief that that we belong to each other, which I think is another Ruth Wilson Gilmore quote. No, that's Gwendolyn Brooks. Yeah, so that's I think bringing the intimate and the personal into abolition is important as well.
Yeah, and just I think that's why so many of the organizations that we work with prioritize direct relationship, whether that's with people that are already in your family, or people and loved ones network, and or people that you find through chosen family. And like as a gay woman, like working with an LGBT collective to have a pen pal was that was about creating family for me in some ways. And yeah, so I think that there's a lot of organizations that offer pen pal programs if people are interested in forming a relationship like that. And then, of course, if anybody who's listening like has that, I think they're, I trust that people who have loved ones inside like know what that is like for them. And I think about growing up like just a town over from a federal prison, and no one ever really talking about it in my community, but it was like ominously there. Like I was a science camp mentor, and we would take the kids to like test the water quality at like this pond, like across this large pond from the prison. And that was the first time that I was like, wow, like this is really here. And what does this water quality mean for the people in there?
So I really appreciate, when I think about the abolitionist movement as, ending slavery, really it was to end, as you all have talked about, it was to end racialized capitalism and to end white supremacy. And if we have those things actually ended in this moment, we know that they haven't. And what I appreciate kind of where you all have ended this conversation is, we really need to think about the abolitionist movement as ending racialized capitalism, as ending white supremacy. But as kind of we anchored this conversation as we were sort of sharing on social media with Angela Davis's quote about this isn't just about ending something, it's about building something. And you all have really touched on at the core of this abolitionist movement is building those relationships, rebuilding those connections. I love, Ruckus, how you connected, we imprison the most people. So first of all, most of us probably know someone who has been in prison. For certain communities, definitely more than others. But for the most part, a lot of us have interactions, at least removed maybe by one or two people. But it's a big part of our life, the prison industrial complex, and in very extreme ways, which we won't get into here. But I appreciate that you all connected how the prison industrial complex is about suppressing those relationships, right? Putting up literally those bars and walls between us. And so bringing it back to kind of how do we anchor the work in rebuilding and figuring out how do we continue to have those relationships and connections and build community despite that. So would love to take a moment to hear a little bit more about that piece, considering particularly, Kate, kind of your journey, as you said, was kind of through that way. Would love to just take a moment to hear, as we think about the abolitionist movement being about rebuilding, relationship being about that. What does that look like in your experience?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for centering that, because I think it's often lost in the fact that there's calls for defunding the police and tearing down prisons, that this is also a generative movement. And it's a great question, because it's still, it's still something I'm thinking a lot about and trying to figure out. When I think about what needs to exist in as an alternative to this form of social control, I think about first just having a world where everyone's basic needs are met. So it's not that we need an alternative police or prisons. We just need to not create the conditions that would cause somebody to commit a crime in the first place. So just all of the asks that organizations like Families for Justice is Healing was making over the summer, to take all the money that's being channeled into punitive justice and putting it into preventative care, and putting it in the hands of Black and Brown and most impacted communities. That is a building that I would love to see. And then on a more personal level, I'm thinking a lot about the ways that I have not experienced a level of communication and care and interpersonal connections that maybe it was just never modeled for me, as somebody who grew up in the suburbs, descendant of an owning class family. And so I'm trying to build very actively late into my adult life this a level of communication with the people around me, my roommates. Been having lots of hard conversations with my roommates this pandemic, but as I'm sure many of us have who have roommates. But I'm thinking about how I can pause and ask somebody what their needs are, and then also be prepared to help them meet those needs, because I believe that them meeting their needs is essential to my own well-being too. So that's a philosophy that I'm trying to really bring into my life, and it's not easy, but I think that it's a practice that is essential to the world that abolition requires us to imagine.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful answer, Kate. I think a lot of that resonates with me, and oh man, we're all practicing abolition so much in this pandemic. I just got off of 10 days of quarantine today. All clear, but so just really, really feeling that in my personal life. I think there's also this thing of following. I think that we're gonna watch a video clip later, I think, that will speak to this to a degree, but making sure that we are honoring the spaces that formerly incarcerated Black women and Black people and formerly incarcerated people are carving out for themselves to do their own imagining. I think a really powerful thing that I heard recently was I might actually come to the same conclusion as a group of Black formerly incarcerated women, but it's not appropriate for me to put to put that solution forward without consulting them and without actually following their timeline and their leadership, because I think another frame that I want to put on, as we talk about, especially as we start kind of circling in towards the state level in Massachusetts and the local level in the greater Boston area, is that the only meaningful investment really that the state of Massachusetts has made in Dorchester, Roxbury, and Mattapan in the last 30, 40, 50 years is to build prisons. That means that the only thing that they can imagine for the children that are babies in arms today, and in my neighborhood, are prison bunks. That's the only thing that has been offered. And so it's not just the money in this really flat way. It's what are we actually investing in for the future? What kind, who is controlling the money that will, and the other kinds of resources that will have such a multiplying effect on what dreams are possible. I mean, there's so much work happening already, and that can be funded both by like personal donations, but ultimately there has to be a people-led process for allocating city money. And that's something we see Families for Justice is Healing doing consistently. That was working over the summer and is like progressing through city legislation. So we actually have to like, and Lord, I know someone will tell me if I get it wrong, but basically we have to amend the City of Boston charter to allow for to give like more power to the city council so that they can impact the amount of participatory budgeting that can happen in the city of Boston. And so that actually passed city council vote there, the home rule petition, I believe. Oh, am I confusing things? Anyway, like it has to pass the city council, and then it has to go to the state legislators and be passed there. And then we vote on it as a like a citywide referendum on changing the charter of the city of Boston. And we need to pass that. I think it's this year, so that we can actually begin to substantively reallocate money as a city. Because, for example, there was some money taken away from Boston Police Department due to the tireless activism of Black people all over Boston, and a lot of that money was redirected by Mayor Walsh into just different parts of the police department, which is not acceptable. One of the really amazing areas, I think, just to really get granular about like what is possible, there is some research going on right now that shows that we could liberate 500 jobs from the Boston Police Department and put them into like a municipal department and create 500 jobs for Black, Brown, Indigenous people from Dorchester, Roxbury, and Mattapan, just by taking cops out of like traffic situations at construction sites. Like, can you imagine like 500 union jobs in the city of Boston that right now those are paid for largely with through the police department and with police overtime. You can look at the website wokewindows.org to kind of get really, if you really are a data nerd and like to dig into that stuff. It's when I saw how much money like one BPD police officer makes, especially in overtime, I was like, that's 3 families in my neighborhood. So yeah, so I think just imagining like that's just like, and of course like having a job at a construction site flagging traffic is not full abolition, right? But it's a step. Mm-hmm. I think that's another really cool frame that Critical Resistance has done a lot on. Is like how do we get from today, which is pretty bad, and to tomorrow, where we have everything for everyone to meet their needs. I had a shirt I was wearing yesterday. It's a Zapatista saying, but it's like everything for everyone. There's enough to go around, and that's like a core part of my politic. But like, and there's sort of reformist reforms and abolitionist reforms, and an abolitionist reform is something that moves us along and doesn't add like social capital, money, time, etc. to the police department. So we don't need to have like diversity training for BPD. We need to take their money and give their money into these jobs programs that will actually materially benefit communities that are being displaced in Boston, like both by gentrification and by the prison system, which are both like they work with one another, right? Like it is through the over-policing and criminalization of neighborhoods that like families are destabilized to the extent that they can't pay their rent, and then they clear out. Then the building gets flipped by a developer, and then people who look more like me come in, right? Like I live in housing built for Northeastern students. I'm not a student.
You're directly relating this to, right, this is a conversation about using resources, and the people who are at the table, we know who's at the table deciding where those resources go. And so this movement, right, is about changing who's at that table, about who gets a say in where those resources go. In Boston, we know more than anyone about how money gets decided. And I think people are trying to change that. And we've seen big changes and credit particularly to the Black Lives Matter movement, which has pushed the needle in saying who gets a say and where these resources go. I think I also wanted to make the point too, that this is also about looking at the facts that the status quo is not working. The status quo is not protecting us. If we look at statistics about rates of crime and our vulnerabilities to that, we know what's happening now is not keeping a lot of us safe. So again, adding that this isn't just about taking money, this is about trying to invest in solutions that actually create healthy communities. And we already know what that is. We just need to put the money towards it. And unfortunately, we're not there yet. And that's where we're trying to move things. So I did want to just take a moment before we pivot to the video. I will share with our audience, we're going to share a clip of a video in a second, a couple minutes. We'll then show the entire 10-minute video at the end for anybody that wants to hang on and see it. But before we pivot to that, I did want to take this moment, when we talk about who is this system protecting and who isn't it? Who is it not protecting? Who does it serve? We know particularly who this negatively affects, both in lack of protecting on the outside in our communities, but also in getting people caught up in the prison industrial complex. We know that women and girls, particularly in recent years, we've seen really significant increases in how this, on the negative impact on particularly Black, Indigenous women of color. And not that this system has not always been affecting them, but we know that kind of as this system evolves, it's really important for us to be paying attention to how it's affecting women and girls. And so wanted to just take a moment to hear from you all, kind of what is your experience in understanding how the prison industrial complex affects our women and girls in this country, and just tell us a little bit about this video and particularly why you wanted to share that with our audience.
Sure, yeah. So I think one thing that I do want to say, so it is true that one of the fastest growing areas of incarceration is the incarceration of women and girls and people who are assigned female. And in Massachusetts, our numbers in general are actually on the decline, both for women and girls and for prison populations generally, despite the fact that there's been a downward trend in numbers, both in the last year, specifically since COVID, but going back further. The DOC continues to agitate for more and more money. I think their budget is at something like $770 million right now, and they want it even more, and they try to get more in lots of different ways. One of the things that they're trying to do here in Massachusetts is to build a $50 million women's prison when we have 458 people assigned female and women incarcerated in this state.
And despite that, I didn't know that we in Massachusetts were decreasing. So despite indications that we're decreasing, we're now building a new prison. Okay.
Yeah, and Families for Justice's Healing has successfully intervened twice in this process and stopped the prison from happening on procedural grounds because the state refuses to follow its own statutes and transparency about this happening. So they're trying to both study and design a prison at the same time without and I think Families for Justice's Healing several years ago did so the most incarcerated corridor in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts is from, if you're in Nubian Square and you go down Warren Ave all the way to Franklin Fieldhouse, that is the most incarcerated corridor. And then Families for Justice's Healing often refers to these as $1 million blocks because the investments go into those people, but in the form of prison bunks. And this is true, again, of women and girls from those neighborhoods. And yeah, so it is true. MCI Framingham is a toxic dump. And that's probably something that you'll hear, if you ever talk to people who are more in kind of, I guess, less sure that we don't need a women's prison, which we don't. But yeah, it is a toxic dump. Nobody should live there. It's horrible. I think it was built in 1847 or something ridiculous. It is really bad. And women should not be held there, and no one should be held there. But the answer is not to build a shiny new prison. When Families for Justice's Healing conducted a listening tour of women from these most incarcerated neighborhoods, I think all or most of whom had experienced incarceration themselves, sometimes going back into their teenage years, into their 50s. Nobody said that the thing I needed was another nicer prison. And you can really see that, I think there is so much work that feminists, and of course always Black feminist leaders, have put into thinking about trauma and how that impacts women and girls and people who experience misogyny. And there's and the state is trying to co-opt this. I think anyone who cares about women should be infuriated when we know that the state is trying to say they want to build a trauma-informed prison. Right? What does that mean? I think there's a really awesome, I think we're going to send it out after this. The Dig did a really in-depth piece on the attempt to build this $50 million women's prison that quotes only directly impacted women from the community. And you can learn in that article more about how they're opposing it. And there's actually an opportunity for anybody listening. If you want to come and bear witness, there's actually a hearing you can attend at 8:30 in the morning on Wednesday. It's a procedural thing about like how the study proceeds or something, whatever. But like it's part of the process of trying to build this $50 million women's prison. And like I think in particular, like we as white people need to go and bear witness. There will be directly impacted people offering testimony at that time. And it's just, I think this is also a state level issue. It's not just Boston. Like we have to be in we in solidarity with our Black and brown sisters here in Boston are in solidarity with everybody across the state because like the women and girls from these neighborhoods end up in prison bunks, like in the suburbs. So like I know that there's people listening in from all over the state and possibly all over the region. It's also, and the situation in Massachusetts is actually replicated in a lot of New England. I'm not as clear on all the numbers, but there are also very low numbers of incarcerated women in New England in general. And the National Council of Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls has launched the First 100 Days campaign, calling on President Biden to release 100 women in 100 days. And that is going to be mirrored across the country. New England is a really strategic place to start because we can make an example here. So I don't know how many people are listening right now, but like we often say in a meeting, if there's like 40 people, that means like in that room 40, do we all have enough connections to find a place for one of those 450 women to go? Like, and I think that's actually not so, there's people who like, I have a spare house in the suburbs, or I know this really amazing program that is like really friendly to women who are coming out of incarceration, or, we can find a place for every single person who's locked up at NCI Framingham right now. We don't need a new prison. And again, and what could we do with that $50 million? If we were just talking about resources, what could we do with $50 million for the children that are growing up in Dorchester, Roxbury, Mattapan, Springfield, Holyoke, Lawrence?
And there are a lot of organizations who would have the plan, who already have the plan, who already say, we know exactly what they need. This is what they need. It's just we don't have the money.
Yeah.
So I did want to just quickly say some of the things you mentioned are in, the chat. So if people wanted to check out the article, as well as the Bear Witness to Board meeting information, that's there. Also for our Becky's Anonymous members, you'll get an email with a lot of these actions, and we'll be talking about them in our growth circle.
Sure. Can I talk a little bit about the legislative session that's coming up too? Sorry.
Sure.
Or that we're in now, I guess. And then Kate, whatever you there's also, I think we're going to, if you watch the whole video after, you'll see like, it's called 60s Till She's Free, and it's like abolitionist strategies for ending the incarceration of women and girls while we move towards total abolition. And there's several important pieces of legislation that you should keep your eyes out for in the session. I think they all need to be filed relatively soon, I think, but it's also fuzzy. Like, again, legislative stuff, I don't know, details, dates. People can make anything happen. That's my belief, so I ignore the state's deadlines. But so basically, there's going to be a bill coming up for the full decriminalization of sex work. Now, there's, I think, an important distinction to be made between full decriminalization and the Nordic model. The Nordic model criminalizes the purchase of sex. Unfortunately, we've seen from people on the ground from New Zealand to the Nordic social democracies that this doesn't actually make sex workers safer. It can lead to them losing their housing. It can lead to them losing their incomes. And it makes it a lot harder to screen and vet clients because they're afraid of being reported to the police. And so it actually can exacerbate abuse. So the only answer is full decriminalization for the protection of sex workers. We also need full decriminalization of drugs. I think there's like a partial decrim of certain drugs bill right now, which is, I think we need to be very careful in how we frame, like how we think about certain like substances being good or bad. Like that's a really deep conversation. You could have a whole live stream about that, I'm sure. And then as we talk about, allowing the space for Black and brown women who are impacted by these issues to put forward their vision of the world. Like one thing is that they always have to be, and we, their allies, always have to be on the defense because there's always a new prison project. There's like, I think one thing we haven't talked about as much today that is newer to me, but there's like plans to build lockups in like 6 counties in Massachusetts. And so like, we always have to be playing defense, and that does not allow us the breathing room to support our sisters who are directly impacted in articulating their vision and putting it forward. So like, yeah, like they definitely do know what their communities need, and like fully articulating that out takes time. So we need to put a moratorium on building prisons at all. All right, so I'll be quiet now. Just want to make sure I got all that in for your listeners.
Thanks, Ruckus. I have nothing to add to that.
Awesome. So let's share the video, as I said earlier, but we'll say again, if you want to see the entire video, which is a little bit under 10 minutes, we'll be showing it at the end before we wrap up. I mean, after we wrap up. So I'm going to share the video, and then we'll hear some last thoughts from Kate and Ruckus. We'll share some concrete action items, remind people about our growth circle, and then we'll replay the video. Before I start it, Kate or Ruckus, any words you wanted to say to help orient us to the video or set us up?
Did you want to say, Kate, since I talked so much?
Yeah, so we're going to be watching the end of a video called The 6Ds Until She's Free, which is focused really on kind of the strategic plan that amazing coalition of Black and Brown formerly incarcerated women has made to end the incarceration of women and girls. So the piece that we're going to be watching is really kind of highlighting the need to elevate the asks of those leaders and be in alignment with them when we're thinking about engaging with abolition and making demands of our representatives or building relationships that we think are strategic in our neighborhoods. But definitely encourage you all to stick around and watch the full video so you can actually hear about the 6Ds and what they mean and how they are strategic in ending incarceration.
Awesome.
Historically, separating people, is a technique that has worked to keep our people in bondage and to keep our people fighting against one another.
It's important that everybody get together like this so that we can share information, so that everybody's on the same page.
Whether we've done this work for 10 years or done this work for one day, every time we get an opportunity to come in collectively, we all get to grow.
Being incarcerated, we know the needs of the people that are in these places. We know what they expect when they get out.
We are the experts who more to do the job than the person that's been there.
So when they funding, they should always fund the experts.
Like, how can we build the leaders, the Black transgender leaders, with these policies that is being implemented with our identity in it, with us not at the table? Hire us to do the work. Don't just call out our names.
Ask the people who are doing the work what their needs are, not what your ideals are, and then let that money serve those needs.
If you're offering us funding, but we can't do this or we can't do that, we can't speak to our values, we can't be true abolitionists and sit in our truth, then that may not be money that we want.
Oftentimes funders galvanize around a particular issue. One of the cool things about the 6Ds is that it takes all those things together.
We really need spaces where we can start to think about what we want next, and giving us the time to build those solutions that we have within our communities, and giving us time to play with implementation to build a safer future for all of us.
And I would also say the same for allies, is to trust our leadership and to show up in service and not in harm.
When we're inside those cages, we're having conversations about things and survival techniques. And sometimes we don't really know how to translate to our allies and our coalition partners. I ask that you trust us and allow us to lead the way.
When we fight, we win. And as a team, and as a group, and as a conglomerate of different alliances, we can't do anything but win.
All right. And as I said, we'll share that again at the end. So I heard, how do we, asking us as white women here at Becky's Anonymous, we identify as white women, really this showing up in service versus harm. And I want to first reflect on for a moment that as white women, it's very important for us to understand, particularly when we talk about the prison industrial complex, just us showing up, even before we open our mouths, can be harmful. As we've learned sort of with this discussion, particularly about the Karen archetype, which has shown how much power a white woman who calls the police can have, including life or death issues. Want to really put that out there as a member of Becky's Anonymous. We're trying to kind of figure out here, how do we understand that we hold all that harmful power, and how do we help use that power to be in service? And we'll talk more about this in our growth circles on Wednesday, but I want to just hear from Kate and Ruckus, kind of in when you hear kind of this call to us, particularly to white women, kind of referred to as allies in the video. But what do you really particularly see as the message to white women and how we show up in service and not in harm?
Looks like you're thinking, Kate. I can tell it while you're thinking. Or maybe there's just lag. Okay.
Oh, I might be lagging. My internet seems a little slow. I was thinking, would you like to go ahead, Ruckus?
Sure. Yeah, I'm going to tell a little bit of a story, and just as a content notice to anyone watching, I'm going to talk about someone who's accused of sexual crimes, so feel free to like mute me or log off, whatever. And I understand if people aren't ready for this story. I'm not going to be graphic, but just I'm talking about that. So one of the people that I write to behind the wall is accused of did commit sex crimes repeatedly. And it was a really big deal for me to actually testify for his release. I had my intellectual understanding of abolition, and that's a place to be. Like, if you're like, I want to really say, like, with all my heart, like I'm like, I am through and through now against prison. Like that, like to me, there's no relationship between healing and prison. But I understand not everyone's there yet. But it was, and one of the reasons that happened for me was because of this story. So I had, like, you know, my pen pal had told me what he had done, and I filed it away. I compartmentalized it. And it didn't come to matter until he asked me to testify for his release, and I had to really grapple with it. And I'm actually really grateful that he had his lawyer tell me the full story, because I heard it from the eyes of someone who I think can recognize the harm and the humanity of the person. And I prepared a lot. So I like kind of work in the nonprofit sector, and I have a lot of connections that would help my friend, if he was released, to lead a healthy life where he doesn't continue to harm anyone. And I was even more nervous than I am sitting here on a live stream tonight. I went in a courtroom and I talked about how all of the connections I had to Black and Pink and to other organizations, and even through my nonprofit job, how I could be supportive of my friend. And the only question that the prosecutor asked me was how old I was. At the time, I was like, 28? I can't remember anymore. Anyway, it was a few years ago. And then I had to leave because witnesses are sequestered. And I learned later that the only thing, so after that one question, after I had presented all of my expertise to this jury and to this court, the only thing the prosecutor could say was that I was being groomed as the next victim, which is deeply insulting as someone. Of course, anyone can be harmed, right? That I have been harmed, and I will probably be again. But that's not what I was there doing. And I learned in that moment that the only utility that the state has for me as a white woman is to justify this incredibly violent and harmful system. I am only useful insofar as I can be painted as a victim without agency that is basically exists to create white babies. That's the only thing that matters about me to the state. And for me, that's the first part, is to recognize that as a white woman, white supremacy only wants me to perpetuate itself. And it does not actually serve or liberate me as a white woman in any way. It doesn't protect me from harm. It doesn't protect me from violence, and so forth. That's the first part, I think. And then to show it up in service and not in harm, I think really is about not learning to I would actually challenge people to take risks, to start with the principles that you have here in Becky's Anonymous, but take risks in principled struggle. To be not only, to avoid causing harm when we can, but know that you will. And when that is called out, to accept it, accept the correction, and keep showing up. Because I think far too often, people, like I have come to a space as a white woman, messed up and gotten scared when that was named and left. And I don't want to do that anymore. I want to keep offering my time and my service in spite of the fact that I am going to make mistakes. And that is part of building abolition together. That's like my kind of top level thought. And then I think and I also want to encourage, and as a working class woman, this is important for me to say, that your money is not as valuable as your time. Money is super, super important. If you have money, please give it to people. Dear God, please give it to people, because we need it more now, even than ever. And time, like what we actually need is that service. Is that showing up? Is that calling your legislator? Is putting your body on the line when it's appropriate? Is taking that risk at work? All that stuff is super, super important.
Kate, any other thoughts? And then we'll end with just kind of going through some of the specific things that we'd love to share with people to plug in with, but just kind of general thoughts on this theme of showing up in service and not in harm.
Yeah. I mean, I would just always recommend like taking the time to do sort of an analysis of our own unique privileges and oppressions, and the ways like that we can actually use both of those to affect change. And so for white women, I think that, like as Ruckus said, there's like this sanctity of the white woman body that's been used to justify the murder of Black people throughout history. And like, what does it mean to then use that sanctity and place a body, between a protester and a policeman? And that's not for everybody all the time, but that's just one example. I think that, like, I'll think back to the redlining that has really characterized a lot of US cities, and how white women often like reinforce that with this notion of like familyhood and safety for their children, and about to that. So like in response to that, being active in your public schools, being really intentional about the way that we like talk to our families or like our children, and what media are we sharing with each other and with the people who we influence. So those are just like some really small, like take a step tomorrow kind of action. Yeah.
Great. I did want to just remind people to join our Growth Circle on Wednesday, where we'll be sharing more of this. I did want to give you all a chance before we wrap up and play the rest of the video to just name any very specific actions. We're going to share to Becky's Anonymous people. We're going to share the SURJ Action Hours, which happen every Wednesday. We're going to share some campaigns. The People Not Prisons Coalition will share the Dig Boston article. We'll share some information about justice for housing, and we'll be connecting with SURJ about anything else that we should be passing on. But before we wrap up, Kate, Ruckus, anything else very specifically that you want to plug for our Becky's Anonymous viewers?
I think just relating to the action
Come to
hours
the hearing
that we
on
do.
Wednesday.
Oh, yeah, the lag. I'm sorry.
No, I think you both were saying the same thing. Action hours Wednesdays, 12 to 1. That's Eastern time.
Yeah, Eastern time. And those. So if you're, I don't know, if like you're not on the email list, you just go to tinyurl.com/action 2021. I grabbed that URL super early in the year, so it's tinyurl.com/action 2021. And I think that's a place, if it's like, let's say you don't have a community around you that's already taking action, we are so happy to provide that for you. The facilitators will walk you through a set of actions, both about prison abolition and lots of other asks that come directly from our BIPOC-led partner organizations. And so we really encourage that. And then this Wednesday, I think what Kate said, and the lag kind of, we got in each other's way, was at 8:30 a.m. If you're in Massachusetts, we would love for you to come and bear witness at that as the designer selection board hearing about this piece of the process to stopping a $50 million women's prison.
Awesome. Great. Well, want to really encourage everyone to stick around, and you'll see that less than 10-minute video in its entirety. But before we jump into that, Kate and Ruckus, thank you so much for everything that you brought today. We could have talked for hours and hours. Appreciate you bringing all of your knowledge into this very succinct time period. Really look forward to continuing to collaborate with both of you and with SURJ. So again, thank you for all your time, and to all of your viewers. Our viewers, thank you for being with us tonight. I'll jump into that video in a second. Becky's Anonymous people, please join us on Wednesday for our growth circles. Check out our intro circle next month if you'd like to be a part of those in the future. So Kate and Ruckus, thank you so much.
Thank you
and
so
everyone
much.
have a wonderful night. And I'm going to share the video now for people who want to see that. So thank you all.
There is growing attention to the fact that people incarcerated in women's prisons are the fastest growing prison population, increasing by 700% over the past 5 decades and outpacing the rate of growth of people in men's prisons by 50%.
A growing number of campaigns, initiatives, and organizations are starting to investigate, confront, and respond to increasing criminalization and incarceration of women, girls, trans, and gender nonconforming people and youth. They join a relatively small but vibrant field of already existing advocates and organizations.
6 Ds Until She's Free is a comprehensive cross-sector strategy to interrupt, reduce, and end criminalization and mass incarceration and deportation of women, trans, and gender nonconforming people.
So the way 6Ds came about was in early 2019, shortly after we'd launched the Interrupting Criminalization Initiative at Barnard. At the same time, we were hearing more and more about both mainstream organizations and criminal justice funders increasingly paying attention to the reality that has been true for the past 5 decades. And we're saying we need a strategy to end mass incarceration of women and girls. And here were all these people from around the country who have been doing this work on the ground for decades, who were coming to town from beyond the bars under this Until She's Free theme. What we ended up doing is weaving together these different strategies across the country, these different strands of liberation struggles into a tapestry.
The 6 Ds are document, decriminalize, divert, decarcerate, divest and dismantle, and dream.
We had this massive goal that we sat at a picnic table in the prison yard in Danbury and said, what are we going to do? We're going to end incarceration of women and girls. And so all of the 6 Ds we do work in, because we had to figure out how do we operationalize ending incarceration of women and girls, this huge thing.
In order to identify key points of intervention, we need more information about how, where, and why women, trans, and gender nonconforming people come into contact with law enforcement.
I lead the research on Black immigrant women, non-binary, and gender nonconforming people. Through hearing these stories, we've been able to see the different ways that people are criminalized. We've seen a variety of answers, and I think that the documentation part of the 6 Ds is critical.
For us, that looks like being a part of the work to make folks aware about what's happening to girls in the conversation around policing in prisons, particularly sexual violence at the hands of school cops.
In order to interrupt contact with the criminal legal system and detention and deportation systems, we need to eliminate criminal laws that give police the power to harass, abuse, and arrest.
The drug war is super pervasive and has been at the intersection of the criminalization and dehumanization of women and girls. Ultimately, we believe in decriminalizing drug use and in some cases people that sell drugs.
Our dream is basically the state of New York will be decriminalized of sex work. We tried to get police out of sex work because police is not a resource for sex work.
Our goal should be to divert people away from the criminal legal system at the earliest opportunity, preferably before police contact arrest, incarceration, charging, or sentencing.
We participated in PAD, which is pre-arrest diversion. We believe in not just alternative sentencing, but before it gets there, we want to divert people away from jail period.
One of my ultimate goals and mission and vision for the organization was to reduce the prison population of women of color going to prison and jails in Georgia by 5 years. And I think we have accomplished that so far.
Decarceration means freeing people from jails, prisons, detention centers, and other places of incarceration, such as state hospitals and nursing homes.
We have several campaigns that we've been working on over the years that have helped people get free. Our campaigns also include commutation and pardons.
We are a decarceration tool and recognize the tactic as a bailout as an immediate tactic to not only change the material conditions of our people that are in cages, but also continue to decriminalize, to continue to divest away from jails and prisons and detention centers.
Beyond moving money out of police, prison, and detention budgets, we need to dismantle these harmful institutions and invest in transformative responses.
We are closing the Atlanta City Detention Center, and not just closing it, but we are repurposing that space, that building, into a wellness, equity, and freedom center.
From the listening tours around the country to the national town hall meeting, we took all of that stuff and we turned it into our long-term work, which is called Reimagining Communities. And it's all things that the women have said, yes, this is what I need. None of the sisters, not one, said, we need a new prison.
In order to end mass incarceration and criminalization of women, girls, trans, and gender nonconforming people, it is essential to radically reimagine our visions of safety.
We dream of a world where everyone can live free of gendered violence without policing, without prisons, which only exacerbate the existence of gendered violence in our world.
And the reality is we want to create a world where we are free, where our bodies, our parenting, our people are taken care of. And to create that freedom, we also must create the communities that can actually hold that freedom. And really supporting families, supporting a new way to conceptualize family support is vital to having that freedom.
Each element of the overarching strategy is essential to our overall success. Each must be rooted in and accountable to the work of women, girls, trans, and gender nonconforming people directly impacted by criminalization through multiple systems.
If our communities are being attacked in multiple ways, then our strategies have to be multilateral and have to be layered and complex.
It's really necessary for us to be working across groups so we don't create silos and we don't undermine or distract away from solutions that are already in making.
I believe in coalitions. We have so much work to do that not one group or one person can do it. And so you have to have those different voices at the table, planning those strategies and those dreams.
Having people that understand the experiences of substance users, the experience of parents, the experience of HIV positive folks, the experience of migrants into that room and into that conversation, it means we're going to have a real conversation and not just go for the short-term win.
Historically, separating people, is a technique that has worked to keep our people in bondage and to keep our people fighting against one another.
It's important that everybody get together like this so that we can share information, so that everybody's on the same page.
It's whether we've done this work for 10 years or done this work for one day. Every time we get an opportunity to come in collectively, we all get to grow.
Being incarcerated, we know the needs of the people that are in these places. We know what they expect when they get out.
We are the experts who more to do the job than the person that's been there.
So when they funding, they should always fund the experts.
Like, how can we build the leaders, the Black transgender leaders, with these policies that is being implemented with our identity in it, with us not at the table? Hire us to do the work. Don't just call out our names.
Ask the people who are doing the work what their needs are, not what your ideals are, and then let that money serve those needs.
If you're offering us funding, but we can't do this or we can't do that, we can't speak to our values, we can't be true abolitionists and sit in our truth, then that may not be money that we want.
Oftentimes funders galvanize around a particular issue. One of the cool things about the 6 Ds is that it takes all those things together.
We really need spaces where we can start to think about what we want next. and giving us the time to build those solutions that we have within our communities and giving us time to play with implementation to build a safer future for all of us.
And I would also say the same for allies, is to trust our leadership and to show up in service and not in harm.
When we're inside those cages, we're having conversations about things and survival techniques. And sometimes we don't really know how to translate to our allies and our coalition partners. I ask that you trust us and allow us to lead the way.
When we fight, we win. And as a team, and as a group, and as a conglomerate of different alliances, we can't do anything but win.